Home is a scholar's forge. I am really grateful for the previous speaker. She set in place. All the back end details that are important to understand. I thought, okay, I've got 40 minutes and how do I cover it? And those details, and so I'm glad. Yes, home is a scholar's forge. And I am a student of history. And I'd ask you to think about, has there been a culture in history where they had a golden age without a school system? It was the pre-Babylonian Israelites. Though the cultures around them had schools, the Israelites did not. And it was mostly, let me see if I'm going to read this one here. It was mostly due to, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk with them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. They didn't feel that they could follow that directive from the Lord and at the same time have their children educated outside their home. They passed an entire culture, the literature, how to run business, how to work, character development. Everything was passed from one generation to the next without having to hire teachers to do so. Now, I realize that in our modern society, that is confused about what schools are for, that probably is not something that we can revert back to easily without a major crisis. And because when you look at the president and the things that he writes and speaks about education, oftentimes he will talk about childcare and education in the same breath. And they're not interchangeable. They are not interchangeable. While there are aspects of childcare in teaching our children is not childcare. It's not daycare. And in my lifetime, when I started school in 1960, preschool was nursery school and daycare, and over 75% of the children in this country were at home with their moms. And I was in third grade when President Kennedy died, and then the Johnson administration started the morphing of our present school system. Now, what we have today as far as public schools that are age grade based, it flies in the face of everything that we know about how children learn. But how did we get into that mess in the first place? One-room schoolhouses allowed children to move forward at their own development. Often children didn't start school until they were about 8. They graduated 8 years later. When they were about 16, most of us in this room would probably fail the tests they had to take, even if we have a college degree. And so when our grandparents or great-grandparents said they only had an 8th grade education, I think it was an honor what they were able to study in those one-room schoolhouses. They did, and there are some misnomers about one-room school education in this country. When I first started homeschooling, I looked for a religious-based curriculum. I didn't know a whole lot about the history of education. I hadn't discussed with my father about his one-room schoolhouse experience, or my uncles at that time. And I hadn't read the history of my husband's grandfather or great-grandfather and teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, and I hadn't explored American literature on it at that time. This was 1983. There was just beginning to have resources for parents to read about the history, and we didn't have the internet. And so it wasn't a Google search away. It's what was ever in your local library. But as I studied this a little deeper, the first curriculum I came across said, well, you can't teach one-room schoolhouse approach math or language arts. And I accepted it because I was part of this generation that has been raised to accept whatever experts say. And so if a person has a title or a degree, pronounces himself as an expert, then everybody kowtows to what the expert says. And it affected how I homeschooled at first. And I thought, well, this is not working. I have children of several different ages. There is not enough time in the day to teach every child a completely 100% individualized education. So it sent me on a search and some learning. We ended up with the school system that we have today as a byproduct of the industrialized revolution. As people moved into the cities, when they lived in the countries, they worked as families. Moms in the kitchen and in the home until kids were big enough and they would go out and work in the field. Or if the dads had a shop, the children would be raised in learning how to do what was in the shop. And we had a work ethic that was just absolutely incredible. We moved into the cities, and at first we moved in factories as families. And factory owners decided that it was cheaper to hire children and women, and children became the prey. And then we set up child labor laws at about the same time we were making mandatory education laws. Well, you have massive amount of kids coming into the schools, and it was easy and convenient to divide them by age because you wanted them to enter at a certain point, roughly around 5, when most of them, 5 or 6, when most of them were potty trained and weaned and a little bit more independent, made it easier for a teacher. And you wanted them to exit at 18. So you really, when you set up a system that has a start date and an end date, you are forced into a system of age regimentation. But what we know about how children learn, in a typical classroom, maybe a 4th grade classroom, you'll have children that are developmentally 2 to 3 years below that grade level, which is arbitrarily set, and 2 to 3 years above grade level. In communities that they allow grade skipping, it's usually about 3 years above grade level across the board. For children who are held back, it's usually if they're 3 years below grade level across the board. In states that put a minimum testing at the 11th percentile or 13th, like in Colorado, it's basically they're over 2 years below grade level across the board. Okay, so parents aren't seeing that. They're just saying, my kid should be in this grade because of this age. And we think that if we bring our children home to homeschool, that we can go out and find the best trending curriculum for that age group of what my child would be in that school if they were in public school, and that my kids should be doing fine. And then we find the reality. Some kids are ahead in some areas and behind in others according to this system. But when we look at them developmentally, we see something different. And about the time that I started seeing what was going on developmentally, my husband put forth a challenge to me. He said, I would like you to look at families that are successful. I said, and? And he says, I'd like you to look at successful families, strong families, happy families, children that have a strong work ethic, et cetera, that are moving forward, and find the common denominator. So I started looking at all the families of the people I knew, and I was working with a family at that time that was in much distress. And so it made the comparison stand out enormously for me. And it wasn't where they spent their seat time. It wasn't whether they were in a private school or a public school or a home school. The thing that made for the successful, strong families was what happened in the home, the family culture, and the work ethic of working with their children. So on that basis, I am going to move forward here. So I looked in the American English Dictionary, Noah Webster's 1828, and found this definition for forge, and I like this: any place where anything is made or shaped. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States, he really had a love for the family farm and what it produced. And he said the best thing produced on the American farm were the children. And if you talk to any military leader, it was those plowboys that knew how to work and knew where their allegiance was. And so I looked at the home as a forge. I looked at these families. There were two families that were just like light years ahead of everybody else, and the rest of the families were down here. And they were still great families. And then there were ones down here struggling, and then this family that I was working with, and I noticed they had no home culture. Their home, well, I could say their home culture was technology. They had no skills. They had no skills in education. They had no skills in running a home or a family. And there was a friend in the neighborhood that had known her from growing up and said that that was the type of home she grew up in. And so I think back to that scripture I read from Deuteronomy, and when we get distracted as parents and we abdicate our responsibility to thinking that if we get the best coach, wonderful teacher, good scout leaders, our job is done. And I think one of the weakest links, we have very good parents, we have wonderful homes that believe in education, but I think we're distracted. We're doing good, but we can do better. Now, going back to that family farm and comparing it with the industrialized revolution, about early 1900s, factory efficiency experts started recommending chores to families as a way to teach children how to work. But assigning a child a task does not teach them how to do it, does not give them a work ethic, does not teach them systems, does not help them learn how to value work. I talk to a lot of business owners with this rising generation that are coming in as employees, that come in feeling that they are entitled to better pay, better job description, rude, etc. And even in our own community, out of good homes, and find out that they don't like to work. Work is a 4-letter word for them because they were never taught in the forge of the home how to work. And that happens with the parent. They learn from you attitudes about work. They learn from you when you complete a task and you complete it with them, they get in the habits and they gain those habits of completing. work, of quality work, of finishing. And what does this have to do with being a scholar? Everything. Because scholar is work. Okay? It's also love. And so is family work. And this is the cradle that Theodore Roosevelt was talking about in the family home. Teach them to work by example, by working with them. There's that scripture again. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. You can have the best curriculum. You can come up with the best ideas, and you can have the best library in your home. But if your children don't have habits and don't know how to work, and they don't take joy in it, you're going to have a really hard time, because you will be undermined and distracted by the things of the home as well. Help them develop good work habits while they are young. So when I throw the factory model of chores out, I am not throwing work out. These little children are working. I had one mom that turned on the light for me. She sent me an email. She said, well, if I'm not putting my kids in front of the screen, what do I do with them when I do what I need to do? And I said, well, what do you need to do? And she said, like getting dinner ready and cleaning the house. And that was when I had the revelation, because in my generation, we did it with our parents. We didn't have chore charts on the wall in 1959 and 1964. Some may have. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Children need to be trained both in task and in systems. I work with women all over the world that were taught how to do chores and do not know how to run a home. And it undermines their effectiveness as a parent. Some were even so cocky back before the economy crashed as to thinking, well, I don't like to cook, so I can just go out to eat whenever I want. Revelation. Husband's job got changed with the downfall of the crash. And now, do you have recipes? They become a believer in the trenches. Teach them the work that they teach them that work, that they can do hard things. Hello. And it goes here, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. And teach them to work from the heart, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So that is the service aspect of work. And goodwill, doing service as to the Lord, not to men. We can still work with our children. And just with that mom and that revelation I had that one day, these moms grew up in daycare centers, so they have no idea what to do with their children at that age. World has revolved around them since they were 6 weeks old. There was always somebody there to care for them and make sure they were safe. Okay, and then there were a lot of moms of my generation that didn't want to put their children in daycare centers. What should they do? Well, mom and aunt, the neighbor next door, cousins, sisters would watch their children at first. And then they morphed and rebranded daycare into preschool. In my generation, as my kids were growing up, as my children hit kindergarten, get your child in our preschool. They will be assured to get into the best private school, which will be assured to get the best high school, private high school, which will get them on track to get into the best college. And they base it on a study of less than 200 children in Ypsilanti, Michigan. They were disadvantaged children. most of them from single-parent homes. And they sent workers into the homes to teach the parents how to give their children advantage. And while it gave better results than if they had done nothing else, it did not make them equal to children that came from nurturing advantage homes. But we have lived on that myth for over a generation now. And our own president stood up before the American people, and I was just like blown away. He was very careful not to specifically mention this preschool study that went on for 40 years. He did in other talks that he gave around that time. So it was very clear that what he was talking about, okay? He started out by talking about all the good aspects of this study in a national State of the Union address. And then he immediately followed it up with his mantra for quality preschool, because we have so many children starting school that don't know their ABCs, 1, 2, 3s, etc. And I thought that was nothing to do with that study. That study was non-academic. Those children were in learning centers, interest-driven. It wasn't about them sitting there with flashcards and worksheets and seat work. And so our president stood there, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. The next day, the internet was loaded with, where do I find a preschool curriculum for my child? And I thought, you know not. And I've been fighting it ever since. Let me go forward here. I talk about giving children the edge to edify, develop, grow, and engage at that age. And why do I call it the edge? Because children that are deprived of a rich home life and developmentally appropriate preschool years are at a disadvantage as they come into school. They now have studies coming out showing that when school is delayed, when kindergarten in Denmark and Finland, the countries that are way ahead of us academically, when kindergarten is delayed until they're 7, which means first grade doesn't come until they're 8, oh, back to the one-room schoolhouse thought. Anyway, children are 75% less likely to have ADHD issues. So we are causing, by our methods and our ideologies about public education and age-based learning that we have in this country, we are causing these educational issues. So what do I mean by edify? Our children shouldn't grow up in confusion. If we are a person of faith, they should grow up in that faith. They should be taught that faith. They should know what their standard of truth is. As an adult, they're always free to change, and many do. I am an adult convert. Change. The important thing here is training their heart, training them up in the way they should go. Yes, that's my 21-year-old son when he was 10. Climbed up on top of the swing set. I thought, that's not what the swing set's for. When my children were little, I got in the habit of taking them for long walks and walking them to the park in cold weather and hot. And I did not know then what it was doing for their brains. There are so many things that happen. All the basic learning they get, the foundations in those early years, come through the 5 senses. And you can't rush it by just giving them flashcard academics. You will then have a child that can memorize and regurgitate information but has no self-control because their executive function isn't developed. And they are all over the place in the classroom and not teachable. So develop them by taking them for the walks. This is part of that Scholar's Forge, reading to them, letting them brachiate on overhead hanging ladders and balance on balance beams and swing on swings and spin, all those things that help their visual pathways develop so that they'll be better readers. I think a lot of children wouldn't be dyslexic or have those issues if we didn't force them to sit still and learn to read at such early ages. And I have a child who taught himself how to read before he was 3. I did not sit down with him and say, this is how you read. He would ask, what does that sign say? What does that sign say? And one day I came in and he was sitting down reading a book that my husband's grandfather, who was a publisher and then president of the American School Boards in the 1960s, had sent my husband when he was in 5th grade. And my son was sitting there reading it. I thought he was making up the story as he was looking at the pictures, and I stood behind him. Okay, he was self-initiated, and I call them koalas, kids of accelerated learning ability. But what went for him didn't necessarily go for his sister next in line. She was very bright. And yet, even with the specialist at the school, who was a trained principal, who was gifted herself and had grade skipped, etc., could not get my daughter to read independently, according to their standards, through kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. At the summer, between 3rd and 4th grade, she came home and without saying a word to me, decided she wanted to read. And she had 2 older brothers, and one of them was completely self-taught. The other one had hearing issues, which delayed him in some areas. And so I got him hooked on phonics to help him with his phonics, and he never used it. But she found it, went in, put that on her ears, and taught herself how to read that summer. When she went back to school, they tested her, and she tested out 2 years above grade level. When she had left in May, she was 2 years below grade level, and this was August. Something had turned on in her, regardless of what she had been through in the system. She had not been squashed. Many children get discouraged and give up, not because they're stupid, but because the system is stupid. And if we as parents understand that the system of experts is not applying what we know, then we can do something at home that will help them develop in appropriate ways. Why do I put sleep for grow? Have you ever noticed that your children, when they were babies, tend to gain about an inch overnight while they're sleeping? That children need adequate rest for their brains to develop and their bodies to heal. They need healthy food. They need exercise and fresh air. Our schools, with their Common Core, are eliminating recess so that the kids can spend more time memorizing, going through paces, getting data collected on them. But they need sleep, and they need exercise. They need opportunity to play. It is during play that their executive function begins to develop, because they role play what they see. As a young mom, I was told that children needed imaginative play, and to me, imaginative play was, yo, land ho, playing Columbus, etc., and fairy tales and everything else. I did not get it. I didn't realize that part of that imaginative play is playing house, playing school. And I think some of us were deprived of playing school and playing house, and so we play it with our children. We play school. We think that if we get the worksheets and we set up the ambiance, we get the desk and the table, and I'm the teacher, you're the student, that it's going to be great. and our kids are going to fly. And then we don't understand when it takes them an hour and a half to do one page of drivel that cheats us and cheats them. I am a no workbook, no worksheet mama. I read Marva Collins, and she said, it's cheating. I thought, what? How's it cheating? It cheats the mom into thinking she's giving her child a quality education. It cheats the teacher into thinking that they're giving the child a quality education, and it cheats the child into thinking that they're learning and getting an education. And I thought back to the first day that when we moved back here to Utah, and I still had some children at home that I was schooling with, and I had three that were in school. And I had heard such great things about Utah schools, so I put my kids into school. My daughter came home and she said, Mom, we're using the same textbooks I used last year in Colorado. And not only that, they're giving the same assignments. And I have to admit, I did something awful. I erased a grade I got and turned it in and got a higher grade here. She says, I'm not learning, I want to be homeschooled again. I contacted a local university and asked about what do I do with a gifted girl who is now grade skipped and ready to get grade skipped again, just flying ahead of her peers across the board because the light had finally gone on. And they sent me this packet. And I thought they were going to support me in being a mom. And the suggestion was that the best way for a gifted child to get education in this day is to homeschool them. Oh, I would say for any child, but it took my excuses away. And as we walked out of the elementary school that day, my daughter was crying. And I said, honey, we can go back. We can go back. She says, oh, I love that teacher. I said, we can go back. We don't have to do this. She goes, no, I want to be homeschooled. I want to learn. And we walked by the kindergarten classroom, and her younger sister was with me. And I said, Jennifer, look, that's the kindergarten classroom. And she looked up to me and she said, Mom, I've got something better that's great for them. I thought, oh boy. The journey continues. And then engage. Engage them. Take them on field trips. Invite interesting people into your home and let them share about their interesting life. That's touched my children. So take them to the library. Let them select books. Take them on trips. We took a 12,000-mile vacation for 6 weeks. Went all over the country, all the way down to Key West and all the way up to the Bay of Fundy and back. And my children called it Mom and Dad's Excellent Adventure. I wished I had done it sooner. I did it when my two oldest boys graduated early from high school. They decided that they were done with the game, and they were going to do independent study, and they did 2.5 years in 1 year. Aced it. Got scholarships, and went off to college. And they did, this is the funny part. They enrolled in the independent study in September. And come February, all of a sudden, my younger son of the two, he was 15 at the time, decided he wanted to go to the Y. So at 4:30, when the window closes at 5, we show up with his application. And they said, you have to get all of your stuff in by May 10th. So basically, they did 2.5 years of school in 2 months. And they did well on the ACT because they had to be able to get that. They got the governor's scholarship because the 15-year-old graduated 2 years early. He got 2. And the older brother was 17, and he graduated early and got a scholarship as well. And my son, my younger son, started at the Y at 16, did a 5-year engineering program in 3 years. And it wasn't until he started taking graduate classes senior year that he first felt challenged. And so, I've seen this with other children. So engage. So the first 8 years, family work. I'm thinking about that 8 in the ADHD study. Well, from 8 to 12, I think is a perfect time for them to learn Dominion training. It's where they work one-on-one with you on the tasks that you can't do as a group, that are bigger tasks, etc., like cleaning the oven and the refrigerator and things like that. And you're going, what does this have to do with academics? Everything. This is the time you light their fire, you excite their interests, you explore new horizons, you experiment with new ideas. You do hands-on, contextual learning, shared learning, study the classics. Those were brought up in the previous presentation, where you learn right and wrong. The classics support your central classic. And I do the power of an hour. It's scripture, a classic, and focus learning opportunity each day on a different, and so I excite interests. And we do the hands-on, contextual learning. Math is better learned in those concrete years of elementary school in the trenches. Cooking, gardening, sewing, building, using math, not working on focusing on learning processes they're not ready to apply yet because their mind has not hit that change that happens at puberty when they have a cognitive change from the hormonal flush over the brain and the triggers that brings on. That's why we do algebra and grammar and things in junior high school. And now we're trying to push it down in elementary school, and the children aren't getting it. Shared learning, shared classics. We read the classics together. I was reading Jane Eyre. I was reading it for a class, and I thought I'd read it to my children. My youngest was 3, playing on the floor. And I thought, well, she's not getting anything out of it. And then a few days later, she came in. She says, when are we going to do Jane Eyre? She was listening to the storyline. And though they may not understand everything at every level, they remember the storyline. And as they grow, they get ahas, and they think back to the story. Oh, that's what that meant. Lost arts, skills. And Power of an Hour, we do it in a 4-year cycle. Art and music, history and appreciation, and poetry and history, and learning about statesmen and geography and math and science, hands-on, living math and history, all in the context of the history. And when we do the language arts, we start with Hebrew. It was the foundation to the end cycle when we do the Greek because it influenced the Greek. Aleph, Alpha, Bet, Beta, Gimel, Gamma, Dalet, Delta. Greek was built on a Semitic language. So the first year we do Hebrew, the second year we do Anglo-Saxon roots because most of little children's language, our colors, our numbers, etc., come from Anglo-Saxon. And then we do Latin roots and affixes the third year, and the fourth year we do Greek. And of course, the little ones, they learn some of the stuff. They're not ready for it, and they get it again when it's their turn to go through. But they're present, and they see that that's what everybody else is doing. And it's 1 hour, and it's like an intellectual, spiritual devotional. Okay, then we transition to Dominion. Now they've been trained. They've been trained for 12 years. The first 8 years in habits and family work, and then the last 4 years in the details of the heavier work. Well, this lays the foundation for what most of us look at as chores, both academic and physical. during that transformational time, when they're making that transition to Dominion, they're learning how to study a topic, how to study classic books, group discussions and debriefs, attending lectures, working on scholar projects, oral exams, essay exams, learning the different types of essays, pre-algebra. Some children aren't going to be ready for this till high school. Others are going to be ready at the age about middle school. I think a lot of children in our country have a difficult time learning how to write compositions well because they have very low experience with oral expression. And so giving them opportunities to narrate stories back and describe things orally for a few years, several years, will give them more fodder and more basis to have something to say in compositions. And filling their minds with ideas and experiences and famous people and tangents. The other day we started out with what happened on this day in LDS church history. We started out with Joseph F. Smith and how he was the son of Hiram, and how when he was 13 years old he was baptized. And I thought, wow. And then at 13 years old his mom died, and then he was sent on a mission to the Sandwich Islands. And we went off on a tangent. I grew up in Hawaii, and I said, that is Hawaii, and it was named after the 4th Earl Sandwich. And my daughter said, well, did it have anything to do with sandwiches? I said, they've been eating food between bread since ancient times. But yes, the term sandwich did come from the Earl of Sandwich. He preferred to eat his food between 2 slices of bread, so his fingers, he would have his hand free, not to have to use a fork. He was playing cards. He didn't want him to get greasy. And so he had his servant put it between 2 slices of bread, and somebody else said, I'll have a sandwich too. And so we start going. We read something in current events, and it takes us off on another tangent through history, and a couple hours later, we have covered a lot of things. Most things children learn are non-sequential. Most of the stuff we have in our schools that are taught in sequence are non-sequential. Most general learning can be learned out of sequence and taken into the child very well. But to make it easier to test, to divide it and drip feed it for 12 years, something that could be done in 4. Isn't it sad? It's a waste of childhood. What could they be doing? And so by somewhere between 12 and 16, they are ready for really full dominion of taking over a system. I stayed with a family. I went out and spoke in Oregon last year or the year before, and the son was in charge of, the 12-year-old son was in charge of taking care of the bulls, washing them down, feeding them, getting them ready for market. And the 15-year-old daughter was in charge of the meals. She put the shopping list together. She decided that she wanted to be the person who provided the food for the whole conference. She put the shopping list together and put on a wonderful lunch spread. And different children in that youth group there, they were taking an entrepreneur class, each did their own project. She came from a family that had a family culture, and hers rocked. She outdid everybody on her plans and carrying it through. Now that lays the foundation for the self-directed scholar, independent study broadly and deeply. And with that work ethic, through teaching them how to work, and that rich experience of learning, and that experience of going off on tangents with a parent, is a foundation for what Edison did. He couldn't read at 9. His mom took him out of school. She inspired him to read by reading him stories of history. And then she had to go do her farm work. Drove him nuts because he wanted to know what happened next. He learned how to read. Then he worked on a train into town and back, into Detroit. And while he was in Detroit for the 8-hour workday, he'd go over to the Detroit Free Library and he would spend all day reading. He worked his way through 3,000 books in that stack there. And with that work ethic, the knowledge that they've gained, they're ready for entrepreneurship. And finally, the mortar. The mortar is they pre-test. They find out where they are. If they want to go to college, they find out where they are. They get with a mentor, and they spend 6 months to 18 months to fill in those holes, if there are any, after that deep scholar phase that they've had. And it all can be done in the home. And even this can be adopted in the classroom. But it's not going to if we allow Common Core to exist. And then commence. They can graduate. Some students will take online courses. Some will concurrent enroll. Some will do MOOCs, Mass Open Online Courseware, and take college courses for high school credit. When you put together your transcript, you can, when they take a college course, it's an honors course if they're taking it in high school. But truth be known, algebra in high school is the same as algebra in college, because algebra is algebra. And German 1 in high school is the same as German 101 in college. But we have been bought into this, keep the kids off the street till they're 18. We didn't have more content to give them, so we just stretched it out and drip fed it to them. So we need to think about how we want to proceed there. And then, or we can hold our own graduation ceremony, invite our friends, let our youth that's graduating give the commencement address. Or you can dispense with all the formalities. I graduated from college, and when I got my bachelor's degree, I went to the commencement part and for fine arts. I didn't go to the main graduation part. So, and there's contact. Questions?